The sound of scraping tires echoed down the narrow alleyway of East Cleveland, a neighborhood that seemed forgotten by time and hope alike. On days like this, when gray clouds hung heavy over buildings with peeling paint and broken windows, 13-year-old Jonah Wells walked a little faster. His backpack thudded softly against his spine with each step, worn shoes barely holding together as he weaved through puddles filled with motor oil and dreams deferred. In his right pocket, his fingers curled around a string of carved stone tokens his grandfather had shaped from leftover quarry rubble decades ago. Each stone was etched with a symbol, a spiral, a triangle, a small infinity sign. Jonah's grandfather, long gone now, had called them the pieces of silence, a way to focus his thoughts when the world got too loud. And today, it was loud. From the mouth of the alley came the echo of adolescent voices, loud, taunting, bored. Jonah knew who it was before he saw them. Ricky and his crew. They stood clustered near the dumpster outside the old community center, where the after-school program used to run before the funding dried up. Ricky had a cracked grin and a way of turning every sentence into a sneer. "Yo, look who's creeping through like he's on some secret mission," Ricky shouted, his jacket flapping as he stepped forward. Little Jonah, the mute mathematician. Jonah didn't respond. He never did. His voice was something he kept locked away, not out of fear, but because words felt too flimsy for the way his thoughts flowed, complex, angular, and fast. Instead, he kept walking, even when Ricky snatched the notebook from his backpack. "What's this?" Ricky asked, flipping through the tattered pages. They were filled not with doodles or class notes but rows and rows of numbers, diagrams, and dense equations written in pencil with surgical precision. "You writing code for NASA or something?" Another boy, Devin, peered over Ricky's shoulder. "Yo, this look like real math," he muttered. "Like grown-up math." Jonah reached out, hand open. "Give it back." Ricky ignored him, whistling. "Why you wasting your time with this crap? Ain't nobody from this block making it out with math." Jonah's jaw tightened. The stones clicked in his pocket. Triangle, spiral, triangle. Focus. He snatched the notebook with surprising speed and tucked it back under his arm, eyes never leaving Ricky's. "Whatever, freak," Ricky spat. "Just don't come crying when they laugh you out of class tomorrow." As Jonah turned and kept walking, he heard them mimic the teacher from school. "Jonah, what's the answer to the bonus question? Bet he gonna write some alien language again." But the laughter didn't follow him this time. It lingered behind like smoke that didn't quite catch flame. Jonah knew why. They didn't understand him, but they feared what they couldn't mock into submission. Back home, the lights flickered as usual. The air smelled of old soup and lemon cleaner. His mother, Clarice, was working the night shift at the nursing home. She'd left a note by the rice cooker, "Proud of you. Leftovers in the fridge. Eat something." He poured rice into a chipped bowl and sat by the window as rain began to spatter softly against the glass. The stones rested on the table next to his notebook. He opened to a blank page, only it wasn't truly blank, it was waiting, expectant. He began to write, not with hesitation, but with urgency. The problem he'd been stuck on last night, one with nested polynomials and modular reductions, suddenly clicked. He visualized the entire equation like a city blueprint in his mind. One by one, he mapped the route. 10 minutes later, he had a solution no high school curriculum could touch. He smiled faintly, the kind that only appeared when something finally made sense. The next morning, Jonah's school, a faded concrete building known more for its broken lockers than academic excellence, buzzed with a different kind of electricity. Mrs. Delaney, the advanced math teacher, had planned a surprise quiz for her honors students. She wasn't expecting Jonah to be in the room, but he'd tested into the program 3 weeks ago with a perfect score. Still, she looked at him as though he were an imposter. "All right, everyone," she said, smirking slightly as she dropped a stack of half-blank quiz papers on her desk. "Today, we're going to try something different." She turned to the board and began writing, an equation that twisted and turned, layered with factorials, trigonometric identities, and abstract symbols the other kids barely recognized. Most groaned as they copied it down. But Jonah? He tilted his head, eyes scanning like a computer interpreting code. "Bonus challenge," Mrs. Delaney said, her gaze settling on Jonah. "Anyone who solves it gets an automatic A for the semester. If no one can, well, better luck next time." She walked back to her desk with a chuckle, flipping through papers. But she looked up when the room fell silent, far too quickly. Jonah had stood. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the board. The marker in his hand squeaked as he began to write, slowly at first, then faster. No crossed-out mistakes. No hesitation. The symbols flowed like a song he already knew by heart. When he finished, he capped the marker and returned to his seat. The room was dead silent. Mrs. Delaney stood slowly and approached the board. Her eyes scanned the work, line by line, until she reached the boxed solution at the bottom. It was correct. She didn't speak. She simply stared, then turned to Jonah. Her voice, when it came, was tight and skeptical. "Who showed you how to do that?" Jonah looked up, calm. "No one," he replied. It was the first time he had spoken in her class. "I figured it out." The silence after that wasn't just shock, it was disruption. Something had shifted in the room. And Jonah knew, as he slipped his stones back into his pocket and zipped his notebook shut, that this was only the beginning. Because they had seen him. But they still didn't believe. Yet. The next day, the air at Thomas Edison High was thick, not just with humidity from the failing AC, but with the weight of whispers. Jonah Wells had done something unthinkable the day before, and no one knew how to process it. He'd walked to the board, solved a problem even some community college students wouldn't attempt, and returned to his desk as if he had merely tied his shoe. A few kids had clapped, nervously, awkwardly. Most had stayed silent. Mrs. Delaney hadn't spoken for the rest of the period, her usual dry lecture replaced with an uncomfortable quiet. By lunch, the rumors had spread. "Jonah's a genius," one kid murmured by the water fountain. "No way he did that on his own," someone countered near the stairwell. "He must have hacked the teacher's system," another suggested outside the cafeteria. Jonah ignored it all. He sat alone at a cracked lunch table beneath the basketball scoreboard that hadn't worked in years. His tray, mostly untouched, balanced on the edge. He pulled his notebook from his bag, flipping to a new page. The familiar rhythm of solving problems calmed his mind. The symbols, the logic, it was a language he trusted more than any human voice. But even numbers couldn't quiet what was coming. "Wells." A voice snapped behind him. He turned. Mrs. Delaney stood there, arms folded, eyes hard. "Come with me." Jonah didn't hesitate. He closed his notebook, tucked it under his arm, and followed her through the maze of rusted lockers and flickering ceiling lights. The principal's office felt like a courtroom, cold, quiet, judgmental. Principal York sat behind his massive desk, papers stacked on either side like fortresses. The walls were lined with plaques and awards from decades ago, untouched by time or relevance. Mrs. Delaney took a seat to his right, her blazer buttoned tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jonah stood before them. "You know why you're here?" York asked. "No, sir," Jonah replied, voice even. Mrs. Delaney spoke next. "Jonah, the work you did on the board yesterday. It was far beyond what we teach here. Beyond what most people your age can even begin to grasp." He stayed silent. "It was brilliant," she admitted, reluctantly. "Too brilliant." York leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. "We've had cases in the past, students finding solutions online, memorizing sequences. Sometimes there's help involved." Jonah's expression didn't change. "I didn't cheat." "That's what they all say," York muttered. "I didn't say it to convince you," Jonah replied. "I said it because it's true." Mrs. Delaney frowned. "Then explain how you knew to apply modular transformations to isolate the variable." "That's not in our curriculum." Jonah hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew they wouldn't believe it. "I've been studying on my own since I was 9, he said finally. "My grandfather taught me the basics, before he passed. After that, I started visiting the university library. They don't always check IDs." York raised an eyebrow. "And you just understood it all?" "No," Jonah said, for the first time allowing a flicker of emotion to show. "Frustration, maybe. I failed a lot. I rewrote every chapter 5 times before it started to click. But I figured it out." Silence. Then Mrs. Delaney dropped the bomb. "We'll need you to retake the exam in a monitored setting. This time, under supervision." Jonah felt his stomach twist, not with fear, but something deeper. Disappointment. This wasn't about proof. This was about disbelief. "Fine," he said. "Give me the hardest question you've got." That evening, the house was quiet again. Clarice had come home early, bringing leftover takeout from the nursing home. She tried to joke, tried to make the evening feel normal. Jonah smiled when he could, but his mind was elsewhere. At the kitchen table, he sat with his notebook, flipping through pages of work, proof, diagrams, logical maps. The beads lay beside him, catching the kitchen light. He strung them between his fingers, letting their familiar coolness calm his thoughts. "You okay, baby?" Clarice asked from the sink. "I will be," he replied. She dried her hands and walked over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They don't see it yet, huh?" "No," he whispered. "But they will." The next morning, Jonah was escorted to room 3B, once a supply closet, now transformed into a makeshift testing space. The room was windowless, lit by a flickering fluorescent tube that buzzed constantly. A single desk stood in the center, surrounded by bare white walls. Mrs. Delaney watched from behind a glass pane with a clipboard in her lap. Jonah sat down. On the desk, a printed test packet sat sealed. York entered, handed him a pencil, and stepped back. "You have 1 hour," he said, then shut the door. Jonah stared at the test cover for a moment, then unsealed it. The first problem was already challenging: matrix-based transformations and quadratic layers nested within trigonometric constraints. Definitely college level. Maybe even first-year graduate. He didn't flinch. 30 minutes later, he stood and walked to the door, test in hand. York opened it, confused. "You're done?" Jonah nodded. "Triple-checked." Mrs. Delaney looked up, incredulous. She took the packet, scanning the pages. Her mouth opened slightly. Then shut. Then opened again. "It's perfect," she muttered. Jonah stared at her. "Will you believe me now?" She looked at him, and for the first time, her expression wasn't suspicion, but uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm starting to think I should." That afternoon, Principal York made a call. It was brief, formal. He dialed the local education board and said 5 words that would begin a chain reaction. "We might have something rare." In his bedroom, Jonah sat on the edge of his mattress, the test results in hand. He wasn't smiling. He was thinking. Because proving he was right didn't feel like victory. It felt like the beginning of war. One he didn't start. But one he was prepared to win. 3 days after Jonah aced the monitored test, things changed, but not how he expected. It began with whispers in the staff room. Mr. Haynes from chemistry mentioned it first. "Kid solved a grad school level equation without blinking." Then Ms. Flores from English chimed in, "He's always been quiet, but maybe we missed something." Even Mrs. Delaney, once the loudest doubter, had started to avoid Jonah's eyes in the hallway. She didn't offer an apology, people like her never did, but her silence was the closest thing to surrender Jonah had seen. But not everyone was impressed. Victor Calder, a regional administrator with the Board of Education, was dispatched to observe. He arrived in a navy blazer too crisp for Detroit's worn sidewalks, his briefcase a statement more than a tool. He didn't speak to Jonah directly, not at first. Instead, he asked to see his test scores, his attendance record, his disciplinary file. He hovered near lockers and asked teachers vague questions like, "Do you think he's well-adjusted? And would you describe him as unusual?" Jonah noticed. On Wednesday, Clarice handed him a letter during breakfast. It was on official letterhead. "What's this?" Jonah asked, brushing biscuit crumbs from the corner. She didn't answer right away. She looked tired again. "It's from the board. They're requesting a psychological evaluation." He froze. "What?" "They said it's routine. That when a student shows exceptional and unexpected academic behavior, it's protocol." She hesitated. "It doesn't feel routine to me." Jonah took the letter with shaking hands. The paper was crisp, untouched, but the meaning behind it was ugly and familiar. They weren't just questioning his intelligence now, they were questioning him. The following Monday, Jonah was escorted to a district center, a brutalist building nestled between a shuttered dollar store and a check-cashing shop. The waiting room smelled like paper and despair. Posters about positive youth growth and academic fairness lined the walls in faded hues. A receptionist with a chipper voice asked if he'd like a juice box while he waited. "No, thanks," Jonah replied, already gripping the beads in his pocket like armor. The psychologist, Dr. Heller, was a thin man with silver-rimmed glasses and a gentle voice. "This isn't a test," he said as Jonah sat across from him. "I just want to talk. Understand how your mind works." Jonah nodded. He'd expected suspicion. Instead, Dr. Heller asked about his childhood, how he first fell in love with math, what he saw when he looked at numbers. "They move," Jonah said. "Like sound. Like music you can hear but you feel. Like watching wind push waves from underneath." Dr. Heller blinked. Then he smiled. "You ever take an IQ test?" he asked. Jonah shook his head. "Never came up. They ran through pattern recognition, logic, memory sequences, analogies. The process was long, but Jonah didn't mind. For the first time, someone seemed genuinely curious, Not threatened, not dismissive. An hour later, Dr. Heller pushed back from the table, hands folded. "Jonah. I've tested gifted students for over 30 years. What you just did. It's not just gifted. It's rare. Like, lightning strikes twice rare." Jonah stayed quiet, unsure how to respond. "I'll write a report," the man continued. "Strongly recommending academic advancement, mentorship, whatever they can give you." Jonah looked up. "But will they listen?" Dr. Heller paused. "I don't know. But I will speak for you." 2 days later, the report reached Principal York's desk. It contained words like exceptional cognitive ability, asynchronous development, and urgent need for specialized academic resources. York read it, sighed, and picked up the phone. He didn't call the board first. He called a friend, Professor Leon Ramsey, a former colleague who now taught advanced mathematics at the University of Michigan. A man who had once said, "I'd kill to meet a student who could outpace me in a lecture." Within hours, Jonah received another letter. This one didn't accuse. It invited. That Saturday, Jonah and Clarice took the long train ride to Ann Arbor. Neither of them had been outside the city limits in years. She packed sandwiches and wore her nicest coat. He didn't speak much on the ride, just stared out the window, beads in hand, watching the city's hard edges fade into sprawling green. The university campus was enormous. Red brick buildings towered over neatly manicured lawns. The math department was located in an old stone hall with arching windows and gold plaques. Professor Ramsey was waiting by the steps. Balding, with thick glasses and a laugh that echoed like a drum roll, he extended a hand to Jonah. "I've been looking forward to this," he said. "Heard you made a few people in the courtroom nervous." Jonah smiled politely. "I guess." "Well, good," Ramsey chuckled. "If they're not nervous, you're not asking hard enough questions." They led Jonah into a classroom where a chalkboard stretched across the wall. Ramsey handed him a piece of white chalk. "Impress me," he said. Jonah didn't hesitate. He wrote. Not to prove anything, but because the numbers had waited long enough. He started with a proof. Then added a theoretical function he'd been working on since spring. He drew graphs in layers, stacking their transformations like a visual symphony. The professor stopped talking. Clarice clutched her purse tighter. When Jonah stepped back, the board was full. Clean. Complete. Ramsey stared. "This is doctoral-level work." Jonah shrugged. "I just wanted to see if I could make it make sense." "You did," the professor said. "In a way I haven't seen in 30 years." By the following week, arrangements were underway. The university offered Jonah a dual enrollment program, college courses in the morning, high school in the afternoon. Scholarships. Travel stipends. Weekly mentorship. York pretended it was his idea. Delaney stayed quiet. The board remained under review. But Jonah didn't care. He was too busy preparing for something bigger. One morning, Clarice woke to find him packing his bag with notebooks and graphing paper. "Where are you going?" she asked sleepily. "Class," he said with a grin. And then to change the world. It started with a ripple, then became a wave. When Jonah's chalkboard math session at the University of Michigan went viral, it wasn't because a media outlet picked it up. It was because a sophomore named Nia Tran, seated in the back of that very room, posted a 30-second clip online with the caption, "This kid just built a 4D math function out of thin air. He's 17. From West Detroit. Genius is everywhere. We just don't always look." By nightfall, it had 80,000 views. By morning, over 1 million. And by that Friday, Jonah was no longer a question mark. He was a headline. Slum Kid rewrites the equation of genius. Detroit teen shocks Ivy-level professors with one chalkboard. Jonah K., the boy who proved them all wrong. Suddenly, the world had questions. Reporters camped outside West High. College recruiters called non-stop. Scholarship offers rolled in, most from places that once wouldn't give a kid like Jonah a second glance. He wasn't sure what to do with any of it. Clarice kept her cool, but Jonah could see the nerves behind her eyes. The world was moving fast, too fast. And every opportunity came with shadows, expectations, agendas, cameras. One night, as they sat together on their crumbling apartment steps, she broke the silence. "I just don't want them to turn you into a poster." Jonah looked up. "You know, make you their proof," she continued. "Like, look. One kid made it. That means the system works. But it doesn't. You made it in spite of the system. Not because of it." He nodded. "I know. Don't let them use your light to hide their darkness." Her voice cracked on the last word. Jonah reached over, gently squeezed her calloused hand. "I won't." Meanwhile, back at school, everything had changed, and yet nothing had. Some teachers who used to ignore Jonah now bent over backward to praise him. But he didn't want praise. He wanted the other students to be seen. To be heard. He noticed how kids still flinched when Principal York raised his voice. How worksheets still replaced actual conversations. How Deshaun, who had once mocked Jonah, now sat silently at lunch, head low, not out of shame, but out of isolation. Jonah found him on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting behind the gym with a busted notebook and a mechanical pencil that didn't click anymore. "Yo," Jonah said, gently kicking the bench leg. "That thing broken or what?" Deshaun blinked. "Huh?" Jonah plopped down beside him. "Your pencil. It's just spinning. You trying to write or hypnotize ants?" Deshaun grinned. "Just a flicker. Can't get it to work." Jonah reached into his own bag, pulled out a pen, and offered it. "Try this." Deshaun hesitated. "Why you even talking to me, man? I roasted you for, like, a year." Jonah shrugged. "You were wrong. You're not the first. And probably not the last. So what?" Deshaun stared at the pen. Then took it. "So? People really think you're some math wizard now?" Jonah grinned. "I am a math wizard. I'm just a quiet one." They both laughed. That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Deshaun. About Shay, the girl in the second row who always knew the answers but never raised her hand. About Tyree, the kid who stuttered in class but could take apart an old computer and rebuild it blindfolded. There were more of them, undiscovered, overlooked, written off because their brilliance didn't wear a private school uniform or come with polished sentences. Jonah reached into his pocket, pulled out his wooden beads. They were worn now, smoothed down at the edges by years of worry and thought and quiet war. He turned them over slowly. Click. 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 Each sound a heartbeat. That's when the idea hit him. He called it the Bead Project. The name was simple, but the mission wasn't. Jonah's plan was to build a program for students like him, quiet kids with loud minds. Kids who got written off because they didn't test well or speak the way schools expected. He wanted to give them more than books, he wanted to give them belief. The first meeting was small: Deshaun, Shay, Tyree, and 4 others who'd heard about it through whispered lockers and sideways glances. They met in an abandoned classroom that still smelled like wet chalk and sadness. Jonah stood by the board, hands tucked into his hoodie, unsure of what to say. "I don't got a speech," he admitted. "I just know. I almost let people decide who I was. I almost believed them when they called me nothing." He reached into his pocket, holding up the beads. "My dad gave me these when I was a kid. I didn't understand why they mattered. But every time things got loud, every time I wanted to give up, I'd count them. 1, 2, 3. Until I remembered who I was." He paused. "So here's the deal. You don't have to prove anything to me. Not to this school. Not to this city. But you do have to prove it to yourself. And I can help. We can help each other." No one clapped. No one cheered. But they stayed. Over the next month, the project grew. Not fast, but steady. Word traveled. Quiet kids who never spoke in class started showing up after hours. Jonah taught them patterns. Logic. The kind of math that made their eyes light up. But he didn't just teach numbers. He taught resilience. Every student who joined got their own bead string, 7 beads, hand-strung by Jonah. Each bead stood for something. Worth. Voice. Fear. Fire. Strength. Legacy. Infinity. The last bead was always gold-painted wood. Infinity. Not because Jonah thought they were perfect, but because he believed they could be. Media started to notice. They called it revolutionary. They called Jonah the savior of urban education. He hated that. He wasn't trying to save anyone. He was trying to remind them they'd always had the fire. In a televised interview, a reporter asked, "What made you start this program?" Jonah looked into the camera, beads in hand. "Because I was tired of waiting for the world to see us." He paused. "So I made my own world." And left the door open. At the edge of that winter, snow began to fall across Detroit like whispered forgiveness. Streetlights flickered. The corner bodegas stayed open late. The slums still sagged, but something new stirred. Kids huddled together after school, solving equations in alleyways. Teachers began showing up to Jonah's workshops, not to correct, but to listen. And through it all, Jonah kept counting beads. Not to calm himself anymore, but to remember that greatness doesn't come wrapped in privilege. Sometimes, It walks through the city with scuffed shoes, a notebook full of stars, and the courage to say, "I'm not who you said I was." The snow fell heavier now, laying a thick white hush over the rooftops of West Detroit. Christmas lights blinked from windows with bars, trying their best to look like joy. Down on 43rd and Oakland, in a tiny classroom with cracked linoleum floors and buzzing fluorescent lights, something far more powerful than decorations was glowing. Jonah stood at the front of a makeshift lecture hall, once a forgotten rec room, now the heartbeat of his growing movement. 30 kids, maybe more, were crammed into every corner. Some sat on overturned crates. Others leaned on windowsills. All of them had notebooks open. All of them wore string beads around their wrists or necks, each one handmade, their colors and symbols reflecting something deeply personal. Infinity wasn't just a math concept anymore. It was becoming a symbol. A flag. A declaration. Outside, a news van idled on the curb, a reporter rehearsing into her mic while snow dusted her hair. Jonah took a breath, held the marker steady in his hand, and began. "Today, I'm not going to solve a problem," he said. "I want you to solve it." Gasps, groans, and laughter rippled through the room. But no one moved to leave. "You all got the power," he continued. "I already know I'm good with numbers. But this isn't about me anymore. This is about all of us." He turned and drew a problem on the board. A tough one, sure, but solvable. Then he stepped back. "Who's first?" For a beat, no one moved. Then, surprisingly, it was a girl named Amina who stepped forward. 12 years old, tiny braids swinging, glasses too big for her face. She hesitated at first, but Jonah nodded. She raised the marker. Her hand trembled, but the math didn't lie. She cracked the first step. The room went quiet. Then someone whispered, "Yo!" And just like that, others stood up. Shay, Tyrell, even Deshaun. They added their voices, their thoughts, step by step. It became a chorus of logic. A collaboration. And when the final answer was circled and correct, the classroom erupted in applause, not for a grade, not for clout, but for each other. Jonah smiled. This was it. This was the thing he'd been building all along. Not a moment. A movement. Weeks passed. The bead project expanded beyond the block. More neighborhoods reached out. Libraries asked Jonah to speak. Teachers came not just to observe, but to learn. Jonah spoke at schools and universities. His TEDx talk racked up millions of views. But he still spent most of his evenings in the same classroom on 43rd Street, chalk dust on his jeans, beads always in his pocket. It wasn't until an email arrived marked urgent that Jonah realized how far his impact had stretched. It was from the Department of Education. They wanted him to help design a pilot program, using his bead-based learning system, for underfunded schools across the state. He blinked at the screen. His mom, Clarice, peeked over his shoulder. "You gonna say yes?" He turned. "You think I can do this?" She raised an eyebrow. "You've already done it. Now they're just catching up." He laughed. Then exhaled slowly. "I want to do more. Not just math. I want kids to see their worth, before the world tells them otherwise." Clarice cupped his cheek, pride shining behind her tired eyes. "Then teach them that. And don't let anyone turn it into a business pitch." He nodded. "Never." The launch of the pilot program took months of planning. Meetings, spreadsheets, policy debates. But Jonah showed up to every single one, wearing his worn hoodie and carrying his tattered notebook and beads. It wasn't about suits. It was about truth. When the day finally arrived, a bright spring morning, Jonah stepped onto a stage in Lansing, the state capital. Hundreds of students, teachers, and officials gathered under a makeshift canopy to hear him speak. He looked out at the crowd. He saw versions of himself in every row, kids who weren't supposed to make it. Kids carrying stories in their silence. He pulled the beads from his pocket, holding them up. "These were my anchor," he said. "When people told me I was a zero, I held onto these. And I counted. I counted until I could hear my own voice louder than theirs." He paused. "But now these beads mean something else. They're not just for holding on. They're for passing on." He reached into a box beside the podium and pulled out 10 more bead strings, each unique. "I wanted to give these to 10 students who already started tutoring others. Who've already become the next wave of leaders." The crowd cheered as each name was called. As Jonah handed each set of beads, he saw something in their eyes. Belief. The kind that couldn't be faked. The kind that couldn't be bought. The kind he'd fought for so long. A week later, Jonah returned to West High, his old school, for a surprise visit. A new math teacher had replaced Miss Pierce. The classroom was different now. Brighter. There was a poster of Jonah on the wall. But more importantly, there were students gathered after class, solving problems together, beads tied to their bags. He lingered in the hallway, watching quietly, before slipping back outside. He didn't need the applause. He needed the impact. That summer, Jonah took a break. Not from teaching, but from noise. He and Clarice rented a tiny cabin on the edge of Lake Superior, something they'd never done before. He spent mornings reading, afternoons walking the woods. At night, they sat by the fire, her knitting, him sketching equations and new bead designs in his fresh notebook. On their last evening, Clarice looked up at the sky. Stars blinked back at them like secrets. "You ever think about your dad?" she asked softly. "All the time," Jonah said. "Especially when it gets quiet. He'd be proud of you." Jonah smiled. "You think?" Clarice nodded. "You turn pain into purpose. That's the rarest kind of strength." He looked at the notebook in his lap, then at the beads in his hand. "I'm not done yet." "I know," she said. "But even heroes need to rest sometimes." Back in Detroit, the city was shifting. More kids wearing beads. More schools adopting his methods. More teachers realizing genius doesn't come in one shape. The word infinity had become more than a number. It was a reminder. A revolution. Jonah returned with fire in his eyes. He launched a mentorship program, then a summer camp, then a non-profit. Offers came in from all over the world, but he always rooted his work in the neighborhood that tried to forget him. He didn't let them. He made them remember. Because zero is where they said he'd start. But he knew better. He'd always known. Zero wasn't his starting point. It was the foundation of his rise. And from that, he built something infinite. Bead by bead. Kid by kid. Hope by hope.